Good afternoon and welcome to the Country Education Partnership Pre-Professional Development Series for 2024. Today is the first in the four-part autumn series, and the next 3 weeks will also involve delivery of professional development programs. So the 4 Wednesdays in March will be involving the autumn series. The series continues the very successful 2023 programs and themes. Today's topic is who's caring for the carers, the impact of vicarious trauma on educators. Country Education Partnership acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which our schools, our families and our communities work and play. We pay our respects to elders of the past, the present and those that will lead us into the collective future. Today I'm delivering from Wadawurrung Country on behalf of the CEP. It's my pleasure to introduce the Chief Executive Officer from the Country Education Partnership, Mark McLeay, to provide official welcome and an update regarding CEP activities. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Brendan, and welcome everyone to PD Online 2024. Yay! We're really excited to kick off. CEP endeavours to be the voice for all rural schools across Victoria. We do deliver services such as PD Online, cluster support, our Rural Youth Ambassador program, the Energy Breakthrough program, but our most important work is advocacy, being the link between the schools and the systems and being the link between schools themselves across the state. We're in that unique position to work with schools from one end of the state to the other. So we're really excited in our role, but it can only be as good as the people who work with us. We also acknowledge any first-timers here today, whether you're listening live or on the recording. It's great to have you here, and we're strongly encouraging you to go back to 2023, check out any of the episodes there that strike your fancy. You'll see that we haven't aged at all, including Adam. So it'll be wonderful to look back. But enough for me. I'm really excited about having Emily and Adam on board today. So I'll hand back to you, Brendan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Now, some housekeeping. The program is, as usual, being recorded, as Mark indicated, and there's always the opportunity to review the session whenever it's convenient to either people that are online today or those that may want to catch up with the program at a later date. And past sessions are also available on the website. The session will take precisely 1 hour, so we'll conclude by 5 p.m. Now, if anybody has a question, please include it in the chat box and we'll endeavour to respond to the questions today. And if that's not possible, we will follow up during the coming week. And before we finish, we do ask all participants to complete a survey, and please do that before signing off at the end of today's program. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Maurice Billy, Program Manager for CEP, who will introduce our guests and facilitate today's discussion. Over to you, Maurice.
Thanks, Brendan, and welcome everybody to this series for 2024. It's great to start off with a couple of really exciting guest speakers I think that we have today, and a topic that I know that going around schools, particularly early this year and last year, is something that gets discussed a lot in our school communities and our communities more broadly. We've known that in recent times there's been some real challenges in our school community space and our broader communities around the impacts of weather-related events that have had a direct impact on our schools, and the wide range of issues that schools are dealing with and our staff are dealing with in that trauma space. So we've got 2 great guests today. In a little while, I'll be introducing you to Emily Clarke, the principal at St. Alipius Parish School in Ballarat East. And she's got some really interesting observations and things to share with us. But first of all, we have someone who we're welcoming back, who was with us last year, and it's great to have Dr. Adam Fraser back. For those of you who don't know, just before I hand over to him, Adam is a peak performance researcher, a professional speaker. He's an author and a consultant. And correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, but I think you were recently recognised as Keynote Speaker of the Year for 2023 at the Australian Enterprise Awards, which is no mean feat. So congratulations to you for that. Adam is also behind the wonderful Flourish program, which we heard a bit about last year in terms of sustainable and effective leadership practice within our school community and for school leaders. But I know Adam's been doing some amazing work in the research field in particular recently, and he's got some exciting stuff to share with us today and some really interesting stuff. So, Adam, without further ado, welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Morris. I really appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces again. In terms of what I'm going to share today, what I'm going to talk about is a research project that we're going to be launching, as well as just a bit of education around this area and what our preliminary research has shown. Now, how this came about is, as Morris said, we work on the Flourish movement, which is a partnership with Deakin University, where we look at how do we sustain school leaders, like how they sustain themselves in their careers and how do they be more effective. But at the end of 2022, I was called by a principal who said, "Hey, I want you to come down and present a workshop on the last day of school." And I went, "I don't think you really want me to do that. Like, it's last day of school. Everyone's going to be checked out. I think that's going to be a waste of like your time and money." But she said, no, we really need this. And I had a briefing with her and I said, talk to me about the school and what are some of your challenges? What's your culture like? And what she talked about was some incredibly confronting things that they've gone through. And what they were talking about was, a very challenging population, a high level of suicide ideation, as well as attempts. She talked about, the abuse that some of the children had suffered. And when I hung up the phone, I walked out of my office and my staff looked at me and said, "Are you all right?" And they said, "You just look different." I said, "In no way am I all right." And I talked to them about the conversation. And this was something that really affected me for about 3 days. Couldn't stop thinking about some of the mental pictures that she painted. And my mind went, okay, I don't even know those children. I can't put a face to it. And that had a profound impact on me. I can't even imagine how that has affected the staff in the school. And what I started to explore in the research was vicarious trauma or secondhand trauma. Now, I'm just going to share some slides. Where's my share piece? Sorry, here we go. So just, I started to explore this area. And what we saw is obviously trauma-informed practice has been something that is a huge topic within education, and there's been some amazing research and programs on how do we help children who have gone through trauma. And if you look at the research out there, it just talks about how schools and educators are in an amazing place to support kids both academically and psychosocially. And trauma-informed practice, as I said before, has got a lot more prevalence and attention. And but what I started to think about, and if you look at the US data, close to 70% of children will experience some sort of traumatic event while they're in that school age. But what I started to think about is there's a huge missing piece. And what I couldn't find a lot of research on is what is the impact on the educator when they are dealing with a child who's gone through trauma. What I could find was very little research and almost next to no strategies of how they process and cope with it. So this is what triggered this project where I had this, very profound experience, as well as I just couldn't find a lot of research out there to look at or support this. Now, to add another layer, what we're knowing is that school principals are now responsible for the psychosocial risk of their team. So they're, you talk about a group that didn't need something else to do. They're now having to really think about, how am I supporting my entire team from a psychosocial aspect? Now, what if we start to define vicarious trauma? Now, there's a couple of terms that can be used interchangeably. In the research, there is a slight variation between vicarious trauma and secondhand trauma. It's also known as secondary trauma stress, and it's simply defined as, how does experiencing that trauma through the child affect them from a well-being and a psychological perspective? And what we know is that, sorry, I'm just waiting for my slide to come up. It's not only I'm disturbed by hearing what's gone on for them, it's also having to manage that child's behavior, which is altered and changed from the trauma. And what we know is children who've been through trauma, find it very difficult in terms of managing their behavior. They tend to be aggressive. They tend to, internalize problems. So they have all these challenges that come with it. So when we're talking about secondhand trauma or vicarious, it's not just about hearing what's going on, but it's also dealing with the aftermath of that. Now, in terms of the data that is out there, most of the data is from the US. There's very, very few studies in Australia. Most of the studies that explore it tend to focus on social workers and psychologists. But what we know is that when you're dealing with a child who's been through trauma, it does have a negative impact in terms of much greater risk of depression, burnout, substance abuse, PTSD. All these things are very, very challenging. Now, in terms of incidents, this is really hard because, as I said before, there's just very little data out there. Some stuff from the US shows that around 75% of teachers have high levels of secondary trauma stress. Now, in that school that I talked about right up front and out of the gate, we actually measured the level of vicarious trauma in that group. Now, what we showed was that 67% of that entire staff were in the severe vicarious trauma range. Now, one caveat I'll put around this is a lot of people who filled out that came up to me and said, oh, wow, if you had asked me mid-term, I would have answered that very differently, meaning I would have scored myself worse. Because it's the last day of the year, I know I'm going on leave. We've spent the day with you. We've had a lot of laughs and a lot of fun, and we've had a really interactive workshop. Just my mood is better. So if they're filling that out in that way, that puts them in a severe category when they're feeling really good. Imagine how they would score it if they were, mid-term and deep in struggle. In terms of, right. So before we go on to that, I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment, and I'm just going to go to one other camera. Okay, so if I move over here, can everyone still hear me okay? So I just need someone to give me a thumbs up or, yep, you can hear me all right? Excellent. All right.
All good.
Here's where it gets really troubling. Now, if you have a group who have high levels of burnout, and we're going to define burnout in a moment because it's got 3 dimensions to it. But what we know is that due to massive workloads, limited resources, we know that burnout rates in education is really high. Now, what little data that is out there shows if you combine burnout with vicarious trauma or STS, whatever you want to call it, as I was saying before, those terms are often used interchanged. Now, if you combine, so if you have an individual that's experiencing burnout and is exposed to this, what we get from there is something called compassion fatigue. And that is where the wheels really fall off. And when an educator falls into compassion fatigue, and once again, this is US data just because that's the only data we can find. When educators hit this, they are less likely to pick up signs of abuse in children. Their ability to empathise and have compassion just simply diminishes greatly. It's almost that when educators fall into this space, their capacity to do their job, even like their capacity to read facial expressions, pick up on changes in a child, are dramatically diminished. And what we're wanting to do with our research is, first of all, study this. And what we want to answer is 4 questions. So number 1, how prevalent is it? So what's the prevalence of it? Is this a really big issue across the board? Or is it just something that a few people suffer from? The second one is, what are the demographics that affect it? Like, is it much more prevalent in rural areas? Is it more prevalent in metro? Is it like low socioeconomic areas have higher levels of vicarious trauma? Or is it just as pronounced in high socioeconomic areas? The third thing we want to do, and this is where the research gets really important, is we want to study what strategies are people using to cope with it. So what are they effectively doing to process and manage this? And number 4, are those strategies effective? Because often when we're experiencing this and we do a debrief with someone, the way we debrief can actually cement and increase the level of trauma that comes out of it. So what we're trying to do with our research is answer these 3 questions: prevalence, demographics. Some data shows that the longer you've been an educator, the better you get at handling this. Some people show that women are more prone to experiencing this. So we really want to understand the demographics within Australia. What are the strategies people put in place, and are they effective? And then the final thing is just what's the gold standard? You look at trauma-informed practice and the Berry Street model. Like, we want to come up with our own model of what's the gold standard of how a school and a culture help people manage and process that. So if I come back to where I was, so that's what we're focusing on in our research. Just to kind of wrap up, Morris, how much time do I have?
You've got a bit of time.
What's that?
Yeah, you've still got 10 minutes.
Okay, cool. I don't want to eat into Emily's time, and actually, ideally, I might be able to give her a bit more. So just to round out some of those things I just talked about then in terms of definitions, burnout was coined by a psychologist called Herbert Freudenberger in 1974. And what he discusses is the fact that burnout has 3 dimensions to it. So the first dimension is emotional or physical exhaustion. Now, when we talk about burnout, we often finish there and we go, well, I'm tired, that means I'm burnt out. But that is only one of the 3 dimensions. We can be tired and not be burnt out. The second one is just where we start to become cynical. We become cynical about the job. We become cynical about parents, the department, even our peers. We start to attack the people around us. And the third piece is that decreased sense of accomplishment. So we feel like what we do doesn't matter. We're not making progress. We can never get ahead. I can never get a handle on my to-do list. And, what's the point of all of this? So when I drew that diagram on the light board, this is what we're talking about when people fall into burnout. They experience these 3 dimensions. And obviously our work with Flourish has focused on how do we stop people burning out. And what we just talked about then is that when you combine that and vicarious trauma, you get compassion fatigue. And as I was saying, this is a really terrible space for an educator to be. Just their capacity to do their job is so diminished. And our ultimate view of this is we want to help educators access a state called compassion satisfaction. And that is where I've dealt with a child who's really struggling, experienced trauma, or is going through something really difficult. I engage with them, I help them, I support them, and I walk away with a sense of accomplishment rather than a sense of drain and an inability to do my job. So what we're going to be doing is, in terms of the study, we're looking at 2 things right now. Number 1 is getting some funding to help us run this, because what we've done is we've handpicked a team of the best specialists in the world to help us do this. Like, we've got an expert in vicarious trauma, we've got experts in well-being in education, and what we've done is put this group together to design this study, but we're trying to find funding at the moment. So our big challenge is, how do we get funding so we can run this? And the second one will obviously be, how do we send this out to get as many people as possible to fill this in? Because when we look at most of the studies in this area, and you would have seen it on one of the slides, they tend to only survey or interview 200 educators. Like, we want a whole raft of people from all over the state so we can get a really good handle on this challenge. We talked about the questions we're going to answer, and also, so I put up if you're interested in helping us with this research, or we've had so many schools go, oh man, I want to be part of that because I see this, I see how it affects my staff. This is where you can register your interest. So, yeah. And how I'm going to finish is just talking about, I've done a lot of research projects in my time, but whenever I talk to educators and mention that we're going to do this, I've never had such an enthusiastic response as I had to this, where they say, this is a genuine issue for us and we're not sure what to do about it. And we're not sure if we're actually helping people or are we making it worse? And this is our vision for what we're trying to do. So Maurice, that kind of brings me to the end, whether anyone has any questions before we hand over to Emily. But that's kind of a bit of background on that area and the research that's done, and also what we want to achieve as a group.
Thanks, Adam. Look, I do just have a couple of things from that, and I'm not sure if you're in a position to to answer these, but you might just want to generally make a comment, because I know that this goes to the research project. But I'm wondering, just off the record, unofficially, in your conversation so far, one of the things that gets spoken to a lot, particularly in schools, is when other staff members believe that there is a staff member that is really struggling and going through some vicarious trauma or being impacted or has compassion fatigue.
Yes.
And they're concerned about their colleagues, but they're not 100% sure what to do in that space. Is there something at this stage that you would be able to just share with that, if they are concerned, what they could potentially do or say or not say?
Yeah, look, it's a big question. From a research perspective, it's very hard to answer that just because so little has been done. But what we have been doing in preparation is we've been going into really challenging schools who experience a lot of vicarious trauma. And what we've found, and as I said before, where a lot of research is in psychologists and social workers. What we're gaining, or what we're learning from the school, is that that camaraderie and culture, and particularly a compassionate response, is the key thing. And what we've identified from it is the importance to name and validate that experience. Now, so often in our happiness movement and positive psychology society, is people express as I'm struggling or I'm having these negative thoughts, and we tend to go, oh, you shouldn't say that to yourself, or you shouldn't do this, or you shouldn't do that. And we tell them to kind of cheer up and focus on being more positive. And what we know is that's just a devastating thing, because not only is the person dealing with the vicarious trauma, but they're also dealing with the shame of, oh yeah, I shouldn't focus on this. And they start to beat themselves up as well. So what we're seeing is supportive colleagues around them who name and validate that experience and normalize it is one of the most important. And it's frightening how often people will kind of shut others down and go, it's not that bad, or you shouldn't take that on, or if you're a professional. The other one was just the fact that following experiencing vicarious trauma is having small debriefs where people unpack it in a non-judgmental way. And it's not about sitting there and giving advice. It's much more about just talking to them about their experience, what's going on for them, how do they feel, how that's affecting them, and then supporting them around more constructive behaviors. So far in our research, it's identified that name and validate, as well as that ability for someone to sit with you and allow you to express what's going on without feeling like I have to fix the problem. And one school, following vicarious trauma, used to do small debriefs, and then they changed to a model of, well, let's debrief as a group. And universally, those people said that's a terrible decision, because rather than sharing with 2 people what's going on, I'm in front of 40 and I just don't feel safe to really unpack what's happened. So what we're seeing so far is that the way a debrief is done is very, very important. But to tell you the truth, Morris, we don't know enough about it to really give you, here's what you've got to do. That's what we're trying to find out from this study.
Yeah. And there are, I agree with you, there's so many questions, because we do see a lot of our schools who are doing wonderful work in this space probably don't, some of it is just on instinct and what they know and what they're doing. And I guess bringing the research together will give them another platform to link into, and I guess to have some consistency across messaging.
Look, one thing they have said is that we don't really have resources from the department. And this is not bashing the department, but they're saying we're having to do it ourselves. Like, we're trying to find out. But I mean, what is fascinating is a lot of people, we got them to rate what was most effective to least effective, and alcohol, food, social media, screens was rated as it does not help in any way. It numbs me for a little bit, but it doesn't help.
I think we could, we could talk about the what ifs and what potentially is happening. But I think what you've done is highlighted how important it is to get timely, relevant data and research in this space, so that we can support our school staff, our leaders who are doing wonderful work in this space. But as you said, perhaps having to dig a lot to find the right resources and information that we hopefully will have at their fingertips not too far down the track.
Yeah, and I don't think I've come across a more important research project in my 25 years of doing research. There's a huge need, as well as we need to help principals help their teams have psychological, social psychological safety, and there's just a tremendous need for it.
Yeah. And the thing is, as you mentioned, is that there are lots of really positive discussions starting to take place, and now there's a place to go with the research and the data that we will continue to track and follow. And I've hopefully and obviously have you back as you gather more information and stuff. And I could probably talk to you about this stuff for hours, but we might have a look at if anyone's got any questions or follow-ups, pop them in the chat box, let us know, because we'll have some time a little later on to come back to it if anyone wants some clarification. But at this point, Adam, thanks for that, and thanks for sharing that information so far.
Pleasure.
And we'll get back to you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Adam. And so we'll move over now to Emily. And as I said, Emily Clarke from St. Alipius Parish School in East Ballarat. She's the principal there. And just having a quick look at the website and stuff, Emily, one of the interesting things that I saw right at the top there, which I thought was wonderful, but you're the 13th non-government school formally registered in the state of Victoria. So you're in the top 15 there of government schools that were, or non-government schools that were registered. I'm guessing you weren't around at that time, but that's something that the school is obviously founded on and really proud of. And just reading through your information on your website, there's so much wonderful stuff there about community engagement, valuing input from your community from the broad sense. You value diversity, you value different opinions and a whole range of people who come together to make up your school community, which is wonderful. And I think you're about to share some of that with us, and also that wonderful work that you do in the school-wide positive behaviour space as well, which is fantastic. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you and welcome you here, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to share.
Thank you. Some days I feel 170 years old, like in school, but certainly not that old, like Willie.
I like how you did the math, though. That was good.
And thank you, Adam. That was a really great presentation, and I'll be signing up for the Flourish. I got that QR code. It was really great. We'd love to be a part of that. So thank you. I'm going to share my screen as well. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about our approach to trauma-informed care at St. Alipius, particularly for our First Nations families. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from a non-Indigenous woman's perspective. I'm not speaking for or on behalf of our Aboriginal community and our members. I'm speaking from my perspective as a leader. My husband is Aboriginal and my children are Aboriginal, so I have the beauty of seeing that through observation, but I would never think that I can speak for them. So I wanted to just make that clear before I begin. And I'm just going to start with acknowledging the country that I'm meeting you all from. So in recognition of First Nations people's spiritual and cultural connection to country, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land. So the land that I'm sitting on now is Wadawurrung people's land. I thank them graciously for their continued hospitality. I acknowledge and celebrate the continuation of a living culture who have lived with Creator God through the whole of creation, of land, sea, waterways and life. I acknowledge the continued care of life, land and waters over thousands of generations and recognise the immense sacrifice and suffering that occurred for us to live freely on this country. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and the hope of First Nations peoples across the nation. May we walk in unity. So for some context, and it's lovely to see Brooke and Kingsley, a couple of colleagues from Catholic Ed in Ballarat in the group this afternoon as well. So St. Alipius, we have 237 students at our school, and we have 26 Aboriginal students. So we've got just over 10% of our population are First Nations families, which is something we're really proud of. And it's probably taken about 15 to 20 years to really build and develop a really positive sense of cultural safety in the Ballarat community. So we have lots of Aboriginal families from all across Ballarat coming across to St. Alipius to join us because of that reputation of a culturally safe environment and a place where we really attempt at all times to hear their voice and make sure that their participation in our school is safe and a positive one, because it hasn't always been the case. So that's sort of our context in terms of our background and why it's really important at our school. We have two documents that guide our work. So we have a reconciliation action plan that we've had for quite some time, but we've also written a strategic education plan as well. So that guides us for a 3-year time period in terms of meeting needs of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, particularly with the new child safe standards that have come in. That plays a really important part in our work as well. So I'm going to show a video now, and I'm very grateful, Adam, for the extra time, because I'll probably be able to show the whole video, which I appreciate. It's a video that I recommend you show in your schools to your staff. It is one of the best examples that I have found for intergenerational trauma for First Nations families. So 2 of our Aboriginal dads came to a staff meeting last year and shared this video with our staff, and it really had an impact in terms of people's understanding of what that intergenerational trauma is. And I ask when we watch it that you really take note of, there's a concept within the video called the pit, and it's this pit that many Aboriginal people still find themselves in because of the trauma of colonisation and past practices. And I'll talk a little bit about the pit and how we work in that space at St. Alipius after the video. So I will attempt to get that going now. Just let it load.
Imagine a line of well-being. You have ups and downs, and that's normal. Before colonisation, Aboriginal people also had their ups and downs, but overall our spirit was strong. Aboriginal people had a strong culture for tens of thousands of years. When the dominant culture arrived and they took over our land without our permission, the process of dispossession began. The loss of land and disruption to our way of life, ignoring the things most sacred to our culture, including our family kinship systems, language, traditional law, cultural practices, and looking after country. The dispossession brought massacres, poisoning, and disease. We lost our freedom, physical safety, and health, all of which impacted on our well-being. They introduced legislation and policies to assimilate us, with the ultimate aim to breed Aboriginal people out of existence. They even took our children from us. We lost the right to move freely in our own country and to see our family. We did not have access to legal systems. We were not allowed to get an equal education or receive equal health care. They took half our earnings and we had to get permission to marry. Our basic human rights were denied. All of this pain and loss can break your spirit. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what colour your skin is or how civilised you think you are, if people no longer have those basic human rights, their well-being will plummet. And this is exactly what happened to us as Aboriginal people. The well-being of whole families and communities through generation after generation suffered. Despite all of this, Aboriginal people endured, and through the resilience of our spirit, we survived. Slowly, policies and practices began to change, and the journey of our recovery begins. But it's not an easy thing to overcome, and many of our people are still living in a place of despair and hurt. When you are oppressed on such a large scale and for so long, a lot of despair builds up. Eventually, you start to normalize that. This is how it is for our people. The oppression has become internalized. When people go through trauma, they often rely on their family and friends to be the strong rocks that support them and help them to recover. But what happens when everyone around you is also going through the same trauma? Those rocks that you try to hold on to pull yourself up, are also crumbling. And like all human beings, what we don't heal in our own lives, we sometimes pass on to our children. When there is internalized oppression and low well-being for generation after generation, along with a society that views you with negative stereotypes, racism and prejudices, it may lead to family violence, alcohol and drug use, incarceration, illness, mental health issues, and low emotional and social well-being, even suicide. Children who are born into this environment might not always have the same opportunities and may start to view the world as harsh and cold instead of feeling love, warmth, and security. This is called intergenerational trauma. Now, don't get me wrong, our people are strong and resilient, and there are plenty of us living happy and healthy lives with strong connection to our families, community, and culture. But many of us have family and friends who are struggling, and when we try to help pull them out, it can be very easy for us to get pulled back in. Let's think about the economy for a moment. The white man comes to our country, and with them, they bring a whole new social and economic system. Our people were stopped from doing things our way, even though it had been working well for us for a long time. Yet we were also locked out of the new systems. This systematic exclusion from the economy and social systems throughout multiple generations has led to the many disparities in the social determinants of well-being that our people are challenged with today. Over time, there have been other cultures that have migrated to Australia, who have also been subjected to discriminatory legislation, like the White Australia policy. They too have experienced racism and discrimination. However, unlike our people, they were allowed to stay together, keep their children, maintain their cultural ways, and participate in the economy. Whereas our mob has only been allowed to participate in the last 40 to 50 years. As we can see, it's a big and complex challenge that we are facing. Even after the policies of colonisation ended, the trauma of these policies and practices still echo down the generations. I'm not talking about ancient history either. Some people say, it happened 200 years ago, get over it. Sure, the oppression may have started 200 years ago, but it has only started to change recently, less than 50 years ago. The last of the 1905 Act was only repealed in 1964 and the Native Welfare Act in 1972. So when were your parents born? When were you born? Many people living today are survivors of those oppressive legislations. The struggle to heal communities and achieve self-determination and equity takes time. The impacts of past policies are still felt today. And now we live in a contemporary society, but there are new policies and legislation that still impact negatively on Aboriginal people. We also need to change society's negative stereotypes and attitudes towards Aboriginal people. Participating in modern Australia shouldn't mean that we have to forget our culture. In fact, quite the opposite. We know that strengthening, reclaiming, and reviving our culture and language builds our resilience and is healing for our people. Many of our mob are healing and living strong and healthy lives with a strong connection to our culture. We can still go hunting. We just might use a 4-wheel drive to get there and be using the latest fishing rod instead of a spear. We can still have a strong spiritual connection to our country and the land. We can still speak our language, sing and dance, have ceremonies, paint our pictures, and pass our stories to our young ones. We can still respect our elders, share tucker with our family and loved ones, and care for our kin. We can maintain our cultural and social obligations to family, community, and country, and be respected as the first people of this nation. We can live and thrive in modern Australia as equals. That's what Aboriginal wellbeing is.
So I'm just going to pause it there. There is another couple of minutes left of the video, and if you have time to have a look at it another time, I would highly recommend it. Sorry, I'll just get to my next slide. For me, it was just a really powerful example of that pit of intergenerational trauma and how hard it is for generations to pull themselves out of that when there's still systems and policies that can really, from their perspective, keep them there. So some considerations, I guess I wanted to sort of talk about some things that we've done to build that really strong sense of cultural safety in the community, and why Aboriginal people are choosing to walk through the front door of St. Alipius and tell their friends about us and family. One of the biggest things, I think, is that perception of the families in our community, and I'm not just probably talking about First Nations families, but other families who have intergenerational trauma as well, that I'm sure some of you would have in your schools as well. It's understanding that, you know, there's assumptions sometimes about Aboriginal people, depending on their job and what they do. And my husband's given me consent to share some personal things, I guess, that are good examples of this. So my husband has a good job and a car and a house and all of those sorts of things. And probably from my kids' school's point of view, he would be seen as an Aboriginal person who is sitting outside of that pit, successful, happy, possibly not needing any support in terms of trauma-informed care. But he has a sister who is very much in that pit, who's been through decades and decades of domestic violence and her children removed and all sorts of things. And my husband has constantly got one arm and hand leaning down into that pit, trying to pull her out. And I think what Adam touched on in terms of vicarious trauma, he certainly has vicarious trauma from constantly seeing his sister in certain positions in her life that are really hard for us to see. So it's not making assumptions in your community about whether an Aboriginal person is in that intergenerational trauma space or not. In many ways, all Aboriginal people are somewhere along that line because of our history in Australia. So that's been a really good thing for our staff to consider, to never ever make an assumption about whether any of our families are doing well for themselves or they don't have any connection to that history and that trauma that we see and read about so much. In terms of our families that do sit in that pit, we have many families that are still sitting in that state of despair for very obvious reasons, and we really make sure that we meet them at their point of need, and we don't ever expect them to climb up out of the pit to engage with us. And that looks different. It might look like, we all have our systems of communication in our schools, whether it be Seesaw or I'm not sure what everybody uses, but there's sometimes expectations in schools that parents need to go through that communication channel. That's where they need to pay for this and order this. And in many ways, we need to meet. Not all families can do that, First Nations or not. If they're sitting in that pit, that can be a really hard thing to do. So we have lots of different. I have a lot of our Aboriginal families that I text a simple text message back and forth, and I'm guaranteed to have that communication come back and forth rather than using our formal methods of communication. There are parents that I know won't step foot through our door. They have their own traumas from school, and I would go out and sit in their passenger seat and have a chat with them after school in their car, where they feel safe, where they feel they can talk to me and it's not intimidating. So there's little methods sort of like that, that I'm sure many people who are listening already do those sorts of things. They create those adjustments for their families. And I've got that point, just relational trust and building trust, and really getting your families to know that, you know, we will sit with you and we will walk with you and we will be beside you. We're not asking you to come out of that pit and meet us up at the top, because that's very impossible for some families. In terms of some really practical ideas, I'm conscious of time, so this is my last little slide. But practical ideas. Last year, we've had an Aboriginal education worker for a long time, and it hasn't always been successful. It's really hard with funding and the time commitment. We've sort of attracted some very young Aboriginal people to the role that they might do it for 6 months and then they get another job somewhere. So our families, our Aboriginal families, identified their kids weren't getting a lot of value from this. Great people that we've always had in the roles, but really inconsistent and not sort of serving over a long period of time. So last year I got our Aboriginal families in, and I was very transparent with the funding that we receive every year for their children. And I put the figure on the table and I said, let's talk, what do you see we could do with this money? Is it an Aboriginal education worker? Is it getting some artists in residence to come in and work with your kids? Is it getting them out doing more things out in community? So it was giving them that voice and that empowerment to sort of lead to more self-determination for their kids. And that was really, it came actually just after the referendum result. So it was really powerful for them to feel that they had a voice and that we had trust and faith that they could make a decision about that money. And so they did unanimously go with that decision to not put all of that money into an education worker, but split that money across 4 terms and offer some really amazing experiences for their kids and the other kids in our school. So we currently have an artist in residence this term who's working closely with us. And that's been really great, and it's given them autonomy and choice over their child's education, which is really important. They haven't always had that. Another thing, my second point was just being really unapologetic about your commitment. It's a scary space to be really open about your commitment to First Nations families, because you may have families in your community that don't agree with that or don't think they should be given the time and the energy. So we've been really unapologetic. We will acknowledge days. We will have lots of celebrations. We acknowledge the pain of January 26th on our social media. And amazingly, over the 10 years I've been at St. Alipius, we've had one complaint in the 10 years from a family that felt we probably give our First Nations families too much attention. That was the complaint. But I think over 10 years, I think when you do it authentically and it's a slow burn for a community rather than trying to do everything really quick, our community really values it and walk alongside us in building cultural safety. And the third thing that sometimes we do, if we're doing our unit of work and we're planning, our teachers are really comfortable putting a message out to our Aboriginal families. Would anyone like to come in and sit with us during this planning session and have a look? Is there any perspectives you can include in this unit of work? Just so that they also have that ability to sort of influence what's happening in the classrooms a little bit and include we can guess what their Aboriginal perspective is when we're trying to include that in a lesson, but actually asking them has been far more powerful. They've brought such richness to some of our lessons that we wouldn't have had without having asked them. So I'm conscious of time. I think that's it for that slide. I just had a couple of really powerful quotes around trauma, around First Nations trauma. I'm happy to share slideshows or anything with people afterwards. That's sort of it. It was a bit of a whirlwind presentation of what we do at St. Alipius, but hopefully it's been helpful.
Oh, it certainly has been that, Emily. It's been a fantastic insight into the work that you're doing and how it tied in, like you said, to what Adam was talking about as well. Look, and I am conscious of time, but just wanted to ask you a really quick question to finish up with there. You about the voice. You talked about connections with the families and stuff, and I'm wondering about the voice of your Aboriginal students and how you tap into that in a school setting. Have you just got one or two quick things when you're talking about their voice in a school setting?
Yeah, in any of the groups we have, so an example, we have a Ladado C environmental group. So in any groups we have a First Nations representative, no matter what the group is. If there's a music group, an environmental group, we always hold a space for a First Nations rep to do that. We're also, it's our first year of being a fire carrier school. So Catholic Ed in Melbourne, I think there's a few dioceses that are already into the fire carrier program. So that's sort of kids going out and working with other schools, our Aboriginal kids, and coming back into our community and really championing reconciliation in our space. So yeah, just making sure that there's always room for them to have their perspective and voice within any group. We've got beautiful kids here who are all very proud, and I even have a lot of kids around NAIDOC week knocking on my door asking if they're Aboriginal, hoping to try and confirm some Aboriginality to join in, because it's a very good thing here to be an Aboriginal person. We have kids coming hand in hand saying, I think I am Aboriginal. I said, I don't think you are, but it's lovely that it's a thing of pride and positivity rather than anything else.
That's fantastic, and I think you might be getting a few requests about wanting to come and visit your school and have a conversation and that. Adam, just conscious again of time, have you got something that you would like to add to wrap up and tying that in with what we've just heard?
I mean, it is such a beautiful example of like intergeneration. That video just got me thinking so much about how pervasive it is, from one generation to another. And when I was writing my book Strive, I interviewed a number of Indigenous people about casual racism and the impact of that had. And you just, I find it quite, it's quite a moving, and I'm feeling like I'm so sheltered from it as well. But I mean, intergenerational trauma is sometimes a form of vicarious trauma. And I don't know whether I answered that very well, but Emily, I just found that that video is so incredibly powerful and a great reminder of just how things carry over from one group to another.
And I love the example of the person trying to climb out, and they said if you don't have those stable people in your own family, it is so hard to climb out. So it's a great example of how some families just don't find it really hard to move beyond it.
Yeah, and my mum was a social worker that worked with Indigenous women looking for emergency housing, and yeah, it's something that not nearly enough people think about or try to even empathise with.
Adam and Emily, I'm conscious that we're just about time to wrap up. And again, as I said in the beginning, it's a topic that I think we could explore for hours and have lots of conversations. And what you've done today is introduce us to the world, Adam, with your research, and Emily with your story from your school. And I think they've been fantastic, and sharing that video, it's given us a lot to take away and a lot to follow up. But we are so thankful for both of you for joining us today, and we wish you all the very best with your future endeavours, and no doubt we will have you both back at some point as well. So from all of us, thank you. And on that note, Brendan, I'll hand it back to you to wrap up today's session.
Thanks very much, Morris, and I also thank Emily and Adam for an outstanding session. I'll remind everybody that the session has been recorded, so it will be available online at your convenience if you want to review the session. Reminder, our second session is next Wednesday, the 13th of March. The topic, retaining graduate teachers, what you can do. Federation University Australia representatives will delve into their comprehensive 2021 study, Will I Stay or Will I Go? Regional, Rural and Remote. The study addresses teacher shortages, offering valuable insights into attracting, supporting and retaining graduate teachers. We will also have some graduate teachers join us for the session to provide their first-hand experiences. So I would strongly encourage people to enrol for the program. Very important issue regarding staffing in our schools. The survey is in the chat box, so please complete the survey before concluding today's session and signing off. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. It's been a terrific session, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Goodbye for now.